Good evening, folks. Will Gray Eagle. You are watching the Deep State Chronicle. It is February 16, 2020. It is Sunday. This segment is yet another chapter of the Adam and Eve story. Let's begin. Chapter 6, Cataclysms Revisited. The last cataclysm, known as Noah's Flood, is pretty easy to study. It was the start of the new Stone Age, brought about by conditions following the last inundation, when even basic requirements for living were no longer available. Since then, uniformitarian geology has been allowed by nature to continue on its path uninterrupted. Thousands of legends arose. 2 cataclysms ago, roughly 10,500 years ago, which we now know to be the Adam and Eve's flood, was the start of the Old Stone Age. You can find these 2 last Stone Ages in almost any junior high school general science textbook. There again, this Stone Age was induced by the total lack of basic requirements for living. It's extremely difficult to find data from the era between the last 2 cataclysms, but it's there. Plus, of course, uniformitarian geology pursued its normal path between cataclysms. Era history is all legendary. 3 cataclysms ago, roughly 18,500 years ago, left little data for us. It is mentioned in Genesis 2, verse 4. Shenadar Cave in Iraq gives us the best data of all. It's discussed in the text of this book on page 98. Four cataclysms ago, about 29,000 years ago, was the end of the Wisconsin era, and we find more data than we do for the third ago cataclysm. 5 cataclysms ago, 43,800 years ago, was derived by Jess Hale, a super mathematician. It's a real search. Slowly, painstakingly, we are still putting the pieces of the puzzle together. The more pieces we find which fit into the picture, the more pieces are thrown on the table for us, and the more colorful and dramatic the picture becomes. If you understand that there are 3 cataclysms recorded in the Bible, Noah's, Adam and Eve's, and the one before that. If you missed it, check Genesis 2. I wish we had the funds to dig and search for 3 years into Tiwanaku. A small idea of what could be found in this prehistoric city of South America can be gained by reading 2 books which I have mentioned before, but will again. The Calendar of Tiwanaku and The Great Idol of Tiwanaku, both by tremendous researchers Hans Schindler Bellamy and Peter Allen. The conclusions drawn by Bellamy and Allen in these monumental works are startlingly close to mine. The city has lived through at least 3 epochs between cataclysms, the oldest ending about 11,500 years ago. Terminating with a cataclysm, the period in its history when it was at sea level, and starting a period of about 5,000 years during which it was at the bottom of the Pacific. Then an upheaval during the cataclysm of about 7,000 years ago, when it, along with its ocean bed, was raised to its present altitude of 12,500 feet. That cataclysm produced Noah's flood, gave birth to Niagara Falls, started the Ohio River flowing into the Mississippi, and started the Neolithic Stone Age, raised the level of the oceans more than 200 feet all over the world, and initiated the era of modern history all over our planet, such as that of Greece, India, and Egypt, and gave birth to the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing the story of Noah's flood, written by a Sumerian thousands of years before the Hebrews wrote about it in Genesis. Each cataclysm is like a giant hand sweeping across the countryside, leaving its fingerprints for us to find amongst the elephant footprints of science in our search for the solution to this consuming mystery. These fingerprints are well hidden amongst the heavy footprints of uniformitarian evidence. The two disciplines, uniformitarian geology and cataclysmology, have no real contest between them. Each has its own place in science, for they complement each other, and actually a marriage of the two schools is in order. Kind of like what Wallace Thornhill and Dennis Talbot did with the electric universe theory. They literally invited members from every scientific discipline, including the medical and psychological fields, to participate in that discussion, which I think is absolutely phenomenal and wonderful. I will be having content produced on this channel about the electric universe and why it, as a paradigm of scientific physics, is the new paradigm, and why it's time to throw out the Newtonian bullshit model that we've been shoved down our throats that's long been obsolete, even as people in my own generation went to school. I'm going to continue the story now. Some of the cataclysmic fingerprints have been mentioned in Chapter 2. Let's discuss them more in detail. The story of frozen mammoths is intriguing indeed. No frozen mammoth was ever found in ice. All were found in frozen, homogeneous muck. Again, with the liquefaction that David Dubine, I'm sorry, I had a brain injury, brain fart there, David Dubine was talking about. It used to be that you could buy frozen mammoth steaks in Alaskan restaurants. The meat had been so well preserved by quick freezing in the muck after the mammoths drowning and suffocating to death, then maintaining that frozen status for almost 7,000 years. Perhaps the most noted of the thousands found, thusly, in the Berezovka mammoth, found near the Berezovka River in northern Siberia. Like all mammoths found wherein, some comment was made concerning the skull. It was noted that his skull was pink from hemorrhaging in the head, plus the fact that he had a penile erection. Both of these facts being evidence sufficient to prove that he suffocated to death in the surrounding homogeneous muck. Further, he was frozen so fast and kept frozen for almost 7,000 years, during which his erection was kept on frozen record constantly until he was found. That's really fascinating. That mammoth froze instantly, not steadily. Wow. The Berezovka mammoth was found in about the year 1900. And more scientific data was gathered and recorded about this animal than any other such frozen behemoth. It's true that this beast also has initiated more scientific controversy than any other such find. To my way of thinking, one man's work stands far above all others. Ivan T. Sanderson, the biologist. He approached the problem from a frozen foods viewpoint and was the only one to do so. This is his story. There I am putting out another cigarette. When you freeze meat, the problem is to freeze it fast enough so the moisture contained in the meat does not have time to form into large crystals while freezing. The faster the freeze, the smaller the crystals. If you freeze meat too slowly, the moisture will form crystals large enough to destroy the fibrous structure of the meat. When defrosted, the meat will be nothing more than a mass of goo, unfit to cook or eat. This is, what happens when you thaw out, refreeze, thaw out, refreeze. For heat must be removed at the same rate from, say, half a steer as from half a pound of ground meat. It would be the same problem if you had to freeze a bucket or tub of water in the same time it takes to freeze a thimbleful. Now, a mammoth weighs up to 5 tons. Those mammoths found in Siberia were somewhat smaller, but still several ton animals. When the Beresovka mammoth was dissected by Russian scientists in 1901, they recorded that even the innermost lining of the beast's stomach had a perfectly preserved fiber structure, indicating that his body heat had been removed by some super prodigious process in nature. Sanderson, taking special notice of this point, took the problem to the American Frozen Foods Institute. What does it take to freeze an entire mammoth so that the moisture content of even the innermost parts of his body, even to the inner lining of his stomach, do not have time to form crystals large enough to destroy the meat's fibrous structure? The Institute really attacked this problem. To freeze a quarter or half a steer presented a big enough problem, but a whole mammoth? Some weeks later, the Institute went back to Sanderson with the answer. It's utterly impossible. With all of our scientific and engineering knowledge, there is absolutely no known way to remove the body heat from a carcass as big as a mammoth fast enough to freeze it without large moisture crystals forming in the meat. Furthermore, after exhausting the scientific and engineering techniques, they looked to nature and concluded that there is no known process in nature which could accomplish the feat. So many have loosely claimed that the Beresovka mammoth fell in a crevasse, or fell in the ice, or some other such nonsense. There is absolutely, positively, irrevocably no explanation in the known processes of nature to explain the quick freezing of the Beresovka mammoth, concurrently with the muck in which he was suffocated and drowned. The Institute did tell Sanderson what it takes to do the job. However, first of all, the body temperature of the mammoth must be lowered about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or 78 degrees centigrade, from its normal temperature, and it must be accomplished in an absolute outside time limit of approximately 4 hours. Actually, they concluded, the freezing process would have to take place in an elapsed time of closer to 2 hours. The Institute did not take into account the effect of their conclusions, which 2 other factors would have made first. The fact that an entire strata of muck was frozen concurrently with the mammoth, and second, the fact that his erection had been preserved by quick freezing. The second of these facts reduces our actual freezing time to far below 2 hours. All that 2 to 4 hours represents in the outer limit of time within which the freezing process had to have taken place for no large moisture crystallization to have formed deep in the meat. The second fact tells us the freezing time, at least for the entire strata of muck and the outer parts of the mammoth, had to be less than 1 minute, or perhaps more like half a minute. The whole process bespeaks of an inhuman, supernatural violence. 1 foreleg, some ribs, and its pelvis were fractured. Do you realize what it takes to break a mammoth's foreleg and his pelvic bone? He was buried in a sea of muck formed by supersonically moving water, gathering and homogenizing the muck, suffocated and drowned in the muck, and quick frozen in the muck in an utterly impossible sequence of events, but nonetheless the process was performed, then kept frozen and preserved for almost 7,000 years. Thank goodness for the scientific and intellectual curiosity of the Russian Tsar, who assigned the scientific team the responsibility to form the expedition into the far out reaches of eastern Siberia and bring back a thorough scientific analysis of this newfound mammoth near the Berezovka River. Today, that same mammoth is mounted in a museum in Moscow. I believe I am correct in stating that it was the first time such a large animal was ever mounted by a taxidermist, or rather, a team of taxidermists. Where did the muck come from which buried the mammoth alive? This frozen mud can be found all over northern Siberia and Alaska. In Alaska, the frozen blanket ranges from 20 to 90 feet thick. Where we have been able to study this frozen tundra more closely here in the United States, the evidence shows that the supernatural violence included supersonic winds, volcanic eruption, swift inundation creating the muck, a sudden temperature change to far below sub-zero freezing, and a precipitous total environmental climate change. The muck comes from the inundation waters moving so swiftly and in such fantastic quantities that the water picks up all kinds of earth, mixes and homogenizes it with water, then lays it down in a muck layer. Vivid descriptions of this layer of frozen muck are given by Professor Frank C. Hibben in his book, The Lost Americans. One of the best places to study many layers of muck laid down by many succeeding cataclysms is in the walls of the Grand Canyons, or in the Badlands of North Dakota. If you stand on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, pick one strata to follow, and trace it with your eyes as far as you can see in all directions. Include the spires jutting upward in the canyon. You will find that strata homogeneous from top to bottom, everywhere as it goes, laid down with uniform thickness, and sharply demarcated from the layers above and below it. Furthermore, if you happen to pick a layer that contains gravel, rocks, and boulders interspread through it, you will observe that ossified muck, gravel, rocks, and boulders are distributed throughout the layer quite evenly in all directions. There is absolutely only one way for each layer to have been laid down so evenly and so homogeneously, and that is all at once. All other hypotheses fall into oblivion in light of the homogeneity factor. This conclusion of the suddenness of the despair, based on the homogeneity factor, is strengthened further by the flatness, uniformity of thickness, the independent character of each layer, and the sharp demarcation between any two adjacent layers. Anyone in the earth-moving business who looks at the strata with the suddenness of deposit of each layer in mind will immediately realize that there is absolutely no way to accomplish this feat through any known means of engineering, nor is there any known way in the ordinary process of nature to move that much earth, homogenize it, even with rocks and boulders if necessary, and deposit it all at once over unaccountable square miles of surface in one single, flat, homogeneous, even depth layer. The only way possible is for cubic miles upon cubic miles of water to move at speeds into supersonic range over continents, pick up earth, dirt, rocks, and boulders in unbelievable quantities, mix it with water into a watery mud, have every rock and boulder grind each other into rounded off shapes as if they were pebbles, and finally deposit it all at once over huge areas of land in an even, flat layer of homogenized muck, rocks, and boulders, which later dries out and through the ages sometimes ossifies, such as in continents frozen in polar zones. Where was I? For many years, I searched and hunted for evidence of what I call sloshing, a fast-moving muck water as it becomes trapped in a huge basin. In the late 1980s, I found a treasure trove of sloshing evidence in the part of Arizona and Utah known as Monument Valley. Never have I been so impressed with the beauty of nature as I was when first viewing the monument treasures of that valley. It's hard to believe that such beauty can come from the unimaginable violence of a cataclysm pounding on a landscape which would not exist were it not for the many cataclysms before the last one, each contributing its share toward the structure as we see it today, with thick layers upon layers, mixed with thinner layers after thinner ones, each with, next page, own unique color and characteristics, with sharp demarcations between all layers. There are also similar layers in Canyon de Chelly, southeast of Monument Valley for a few miles. The thick layers, approximately 60 to 80 feet thick, provided the sloshing evidence, even though each one of these thick layers showed definite evidence of having been deposited all at once, each layer with its own color and integral appearance. There was a diagonal sublayer, grain flow within each layer, tilted about 20 degrees off horizontal, with an adjacent sublayer tilted in the opposite direction, both above and below it. These tilted sublayers, and comprising some very thick layers, were stacked upon each other in 15 sublayers, all the same thickness and each tilted in opposite directions from the layers adjacent to itself. This evidence then finally provided the proof that sloshing does occur in a cataclysm. As the rapid, moving muck water sloshed back and forth across the valley, it deposited a little of itself with each slosh. It was moving so fast as to deposit the same amount of itself with each slosh, the total being so homogenized that each sublayer has the same characteristic as each and every one above and below it. Only the grain structure varies in slant with each sublayer. This structure is evident in miles upon miles of surrounding walls of the valley, as well as in the monuments therein. Before leaving Monument Valley, I'd like to tell you about one special place in the eastern part of the valley, Mexican Hat. It's a small town sitting next to the San Joaquin River, with a short plateau on the other side of the river, and on the other side of the plateau rises the most unusual mountainside in the world, as many geologists have declared who have come to Mexican Hat from all over the world just to see that mountainside. It rises about 2,000 feet into the sky, with all of its grandeur of many sedimentary stratifications, large and small, in evidence. The unique feature of the whole mountainside is that the sedimentary layers all bend over down toward the river, as if they were trying to flow into it and disappear. Thousands and thousands of feet of sedimentary strata are bent over toward and into the river in this fashion. Change my glasses. This scene is one of the most dramatic I have ever seen, proving the superviolence that occurs during a cataclysm. In this case, a huge fissure opened in the earth where the San Joaquin River flows now. The fissure being opened enough to be as a huge jaw opening to its throat, with the molten layer normally 60 miles beneath. Of course, the molten layer would rise into the 60-mile throat, being 60 miles below that of seething white-hot molten everything beneath. The 60-mile thick shell presses down, while also providing a huge fissure for that pressure to push the molten stuff upward into the gaping throat fissure. Now we have the most awesome, horrific, appalling, formidable, terrifying, uncanny, ultimately violent, paroxysmic, cataclysmic collision of the forces of nature on the surface of our planet. Even beyond imagination until you see for yourself, right as Mexican Hat, with the side of that mountain stopped, cold in the midst of its death throes. At this point, the supersonically rampaging oceans and wind hit the scene. So we have a super earthquake so huge as to open a fissure in the whole shell of the earth, opening a path for the molten layer below to be pressed upward into the fissure. The molten invader melting the hard layer beneath that side of the mountain, the 1,000 per mile hour ocean water slaughtering the mountainside, having lost its foundations, driving it down into the huge fissure and steaming the molten stuff below into solidity. And the mountainside stops, feeding itself downward into the maw, while the oceans in their fury pass on, leaving a huge part of themselves sloshing around and back and forth in the valley, plus some surviving, beautiful, picturesque monuments standing today for us to see. In other parts of the valley, upheavals of sedimentary strata in huge structures point upward, with the rock being scorched in a plethora of places. Church Rock and Agathla Rain each has many scorched sedimentary boulders scattered around near its base. I have read geologist reports and have been told by Wayne, one of the tour guides at Monument Valley Lodge, one of the nicest places to stay, that he has read geologist reports all telling of lava flows in Monument Valley. And I have spent some time through several years in Monument Valley searching from one end to the other, and even beyond the valley for any evidences of lava. I have never found any such evidence anywhere, of even a suggestion of lava. All I ever could find was scorched sedimentary rock, which, from a distance, could have fooled anyone into thinking it was lava rock. I have seen dark scorched rock in abandoned gold mines near Pikes Peak, which scorching occurred during a cataclysm when the heat from the 60-mile molten layer broke through fissures in the 60-mile thick hard outer shell of the inner earth, scorching the rocks in that shell. Going back to the oceans of water, mixing with earth and rocks and laying down layers and sloshing sublayers of sediment, a good measure of the speed with which the water must move over the land is provided for us by the granite blocks on the eastern slopes of the Jura Mountains in France. Deluc Sr. von Buch and Deluc Jr. and de Saussure give us much information through their early geological observations of the dispersion of the alpine granite blocks through all the mountains. Excuse me. Valleys and lakes of Italy, Switzerland, and France. Even Bakewell, through his early dissenting observations, lends more credence to the fast-moving water conclusions of the other men because of the looseness of his arguments. The great Swiss geologist Escher gave the most credence to the fast-moving water argument through his observations, which support the earliest concepts set forth by J. André Deluc Jr. in the 1820s. Now let us envision the Jura Mountains as if we were looking down from an airplane. First of all, we noticed that they are similar to the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, for they look like a giant, wrinkled-up carpet with rolling ridges running from northeast to southwest. The Swiss-French border follows the same direction in the middle of the range. You can also see that the ridges have passes through them here and there, so that a person on the ground can see northwest through one ridge to the southeastern slope of the next ridge in many places. It's a well-known fact that the Jura Mountains are non-granitic. Whatever granite exists in those mountains is still buried deep in them. They are largely calcareous. However, on the southeastern slopes of the ridges, there are countless granite blocks sitting on the surface. These blocks, each weighing tons upon tons, have been traced to the Swiss Alps, across the Swiss Valley, to the southeast, and if you look several ridges to the northwest, in the Juras, you will find the granite blocks. Only on the southeastern slope of the ridge, and clustered only opposite, passes through the ridge adjacent to the southeast. These blocks sit on the slope at an altitude the same as where they came from in the Alps of Italy and Switzerland, 50 to 80 miles across the valley from Switzerland to where they were deposited on the Juras. In order for them to be found on the southeastern slopes of the Juras where they are, a tremendous upheaval of granite in the Italian-Swiss Alps had to occur during some cataclysmic violence, followed by water moving at such fantastic speeds as to sweep the mighty blocks of granite from 50 to 80 miles across Switzerland over to the Juras, through the passes, and deposit them in clusters against the southeastern slopes of the inner ridges of the Juras. It fits perfectly with the picture of supernatural violence uncovered by Professor Frank C. Hibben in his studies of shredded and dismembered prehistoric animals in Alaska, buried and quick frozen in and with muck, together with twisted, torn, burned, and quick frozen trees. Hibben states that one necessary force in the contributing factors is supersonic winds. The only way of generating such winds over tremendous areas is to move the land in such a way as to depart from its normal west to east daily rotation, so the atmosphere, continuing its normal daily rotation, will then be moving at supersonic speeds relative to the land over which it is moving. Now, in the Earth's normal rotation, the oceans also rotate west to east, one revolution per day. When a cataclysm occurs, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth slips in a direction differing from that of its normal rotation. The atmosphere continues its normal rotational direction, and the oceans also refuse to change their rotational direction. So, the atmosphere and oceans perceive to move over land masses which are passing underneath them in a new direction. Some of the oceans and air moving at supersonic speeds with respect to the land moving in a different direction underneath. With oceans moving over land masses at such speeds, it's easy to understand how the huge granite blocks were moved from the Alps to the Juras while losing little or no altitude, and how cubic miles of earth can be picked up, mixed with water, and homogenized, then laid down in an even, flat, independent layer such as we find exposed in the walls of the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, and Canyon de Chelly. Further, we can understand how the irresistibly, overwhelmingly annihilating force of the waters, moving at utterly unbelievable speeds, can, in the blink of an eye, obliterate entire civilizations and every vestige of anything they have ever accomplished. Even in our times, there have been occasions when a simple dam's breaking and releasing its waters over a small town below literally wiped out every splinter of evidence of the town and people having ever been there. One of the fingerprints which a cataclysmic giant hand leaves tells us of the supernatural violence on the earth is the plethora of mammalian teeth of many, many species found in the sharp demarcation boundaries between sedimentary layers such as we see exposed in the Grand Canyon. It bespeaks of animal life being pulverized with teeth, the only mammalian substance hard enough to withstand the onslaught. Some places undergo less violent winds and inundation, to be sure, and there we find traces of prehistoric civilizations which had advanced to achievements we deem impossible for that many years ago. Let's go back to Tiahuanaco in South America to see what's there. The Incas discovered this deserted city at 12,500 feet altitude on the shores of Lake Titicaca in the 2nd century AD. Although they lived in that land for generations upon generations, centuries after centuries, they left it totally undisturbed. Anyone who has been on a hunt for gold or treasure in the mountains, as I have been in New Mexico, knows the Indian credo. What is in the mountains belongs to the mountain. That means that whatever they find, they do not disturb nor destroy, nor move, nor remove. You can read about it, see it portrayed in movies, or be told about it, but there is nothing like seeing it in person when gold fever takes over an entire personality. It's a kind of consummate greed which changes a veteran outdoorsman to a wild-eyed, scheming, secretive, intense introvert who could lead himself and others to destruction and death through his greed. I have seen it. Tiahuanaco was found by Pizarro and his band of plunderers in the 1520s. The gold fever had evidently taken over his entire expedition of 13 to 16 men, for they proceeded to vandalize almost everything in sight. They smashed thousands of statues searching for gold. There were huge silver bolts of up to several tons each, passing through massive stone monoliths. You guessed it, they broke up the monoliths in order to obtain the silver bolts. There was one member of the earlier discoverers, a Spanish priest, Diego de Alcabaso, who wrote down what he saw. I saw a vast hall carved on its roof to represent thatch. There were the waters of a lake which washed the walls of a splendid court in the city of the dead. And standing in its fine court, in the shallows of the water, on the platform of a superb colonnade, were many fine statues of men and women. So real they were that they seemed to be alive. Some had goblets and upraised drinking cups. Others sat or reclined, as in life. Some walked in the stream flowing by the ancient walls. Women carved in stone, dandled babies in their laps, or bore them on their backs. In a thousand natural postures, people stood or reclined. Not one of these statues stands today. The greed of civilization has literally devastated Tiwanaku with vandalism and thievery. However, vandals through the centuries who visited this fabulous storehouse of prehistory did what most do who have the treasure fever. They ignored the intellectual values, which were less obvious. The great stone gate in the temple of Kalasaya has inscriptions across its arch on its pillars which, to the untrained eye, appear to be but meaningless picture carvings. It remained for Arthur Kosminski to realize its importance. He was followed by Wendell Bennett and John Phillips. Then Hans Schindler Bellamy and Peter Allen completed the picture with their brilliant deciphering and translation of the pictures, so aptly described in their book, The Calendar of Tiwanaku, and their later book, The Great Idol of Tiwanaku. Evinces further their brilliance in deciphering and translating the picture symbols carved in a monolithic statue excavated from a buried temple. This book not only explains their deciphering and translating, but tells of the arduous work performed in order to preserve the tremendous monolith. The only thing they don't explain is why this huge statue has two left hands and no right hand. That's peculiar. The works of Bellamy and Allen show many things concerning the calendar and time standards of Tiwanaku in two different epochs, probably the Caspian and Hudson Bay eras. The details and differences between hours, days, and years, then and now, I shall leave to those who wish to read those books. The main point of their discussion, which should be noted here, is that the idol and the calendar both recorded that during both eras, a retrograde moon satellite orbited around the Earth during the idol's era, probably 29,000 to 18,500 years ago. The satellite was approximately 24,150 miles from the Earth, and during the calendar gate's era, probably 18,500 to 11,500 years ago, the satellite was approximately 23,360 miles from the Earth. Obviously, the moon satellite was far closer to our planet than our present moon. Obviously, it passed the Roche limit of approximately 8,000 miles from the Earth and disintegrated, accounting for many legends of prehistory of terrible impacts with the Earth by asteroids or comets. Where did the moon satellite come from? How did our planet capture it? And of course, where did our present moon satellite come from? When did our planet capture it? And how and why did it happen? If Tiwanaku and its moon satellite are to make any sense for us, these questions must be answered. The Bode-Titius relationship may give us a key to the answer. Titius and Bode, two German astronomers, individually, concurrently, discovered this relationship in the 18th century. If we take orbit numbers, or ring numbers, of the planets through Saturn the ring numbers being 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, multiply each number by 3, add 4 to each result, divide each by 10, the series becomes 0.4, 0.7, 1.0, 1.6, 2.8, 5.2, and 10.0. These numbers, accepting and skipping 2.8, represent the relative distances of the then known planets from the Sun: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. 2.8, I believe this is the planet that became the asteroid belt, Electra, or Marduk, as it's known in some legends. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Right, there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter, the former fifth planet, as I call it, and Saturn, with 2.8 representing no known planet at that time for that distance. That's really intriguing. When the planet Uranus was discovered in 1781, it fit right into the series at 19.6. So that's not the missing planet. That's way out there. That's so many astronomical units away from where 2.8 is supposed to be. The law seems strengthened, and the series at 19.6, the law seems strengthened, and an intense search was initiated for anything that might be at the 2.8 distance. In 1801, the little planetoid Ceres was discovered at 2.8. By 1945, more than 1,500 more were found on the same orbit. It has been well established as the ring of minor planets or planetoids or asteroids. In 1846, the planet Neptune was discovered, and it seemed to disobey the rules set down by Bode-Titius relationship. It should have been at 38.8 on the relative distance scale, but it was closer to 29.2. In 1932, the planet Pluto was discovered, and the Bode-Titius law seemed to fall apart completely. Pluto was found close to 38.8, where Neptune was supposed to be, whereas the law seemed to indicate that Pluto should be at 77.2. Since that time, the relationship commonly known as Bode's law has been regarded in astronomy as nothing more than an insignificant curiosity. Perhaps a new look at Bode's law is in order. If so, much of it is correct. Then the part of it which appears to be erroneous seems to be so only because of our lack of understanding of the basics involved. First, instead of using relative numbers, we shall work with ring numbers or orbit numbers, the first progression being 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. Represents these numbers. Also, instead of this progression, which is geometric except for the 0, let's fill in all the numbers making a true arithmetic progression. The numbers will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so on to 256. Now in this progression, the ring numbers 0, 1, 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and 256 can be regarded as fundamental rings. All other rings can be regarded as harmonic rings. Between any two fundamentals, the ring which lies halfway between is the first harmonic. Any ring which lies halfway between a fundamental and a first harmonic is a second harmonic. Any ring halfway between a second harmonic and a first harmonic, or halfway between a second harmonic and a fundamental, is a third harmonic, and so on. The next step is to label the ring numbers with the planets as they are actually positioned in the solar system. We can simplify the table if we take all of the ring numbers up to 8. Then only the fundamentals, first and second harmonics beyond that to Uranus, then the fundamentals, first, second, and third harmonics to ring 256. The first thing that we notice is that all of the planets are on fundamentals except Neptune. Neptune also happens to be the only planet in the solar system completely turned on its side. It's the only planet which is on a harmonic ring, as it appears on the first harmonic between 96, between Uranus and Pluto, which are on fundamental 64 and 128 respectively. Now we come to another discovery. The number of rings between the planets increases the further away from the sun the planets are, until it appears that the maximum number of rings possible between the planets is 31. On each 32nd ring, there has to be a planet, whether the ring is a fundamental or a harmonic. That's why Neptune is on the 36th ring, a first harmonic, the 32nd ring after Uranus, with Pluto on the 128th ring, a fundamental, the 32nd ring after Neptune. Something else appears apparent also. When the solar system was born, planets tried to be born on each ring. Full-blown planets were born on every fundamental and on any ring 31 rings away from any harmonic ring. 31 rings away from any other planet on all other rings, minor planets were born. On a ring of planetoids, since there are 4 major planets inside the ring of planetoids on 8, let's assume that the entire solar system is made up of 3 groups of 4 major planets, plus a ring of planetoids in each group. This means that there may be 2 more undiscovered planetoid rings, 112 and 240. If we look at the minor planet rings on either side of Jupiter and apply Kepler's laws to them, we find that the moons of Jupiter, even the retrograde ones, are explained as captured minor planets from both inside and outside harmonic rings around Jupiter. Before we examine the results of our construction, let's look into the outer regions of the solar system. Ring 256 is where the comets turn around and head back into the heart of the system. Further, it is known that there is more than one planet outside of Pluto. Our table tells us that there should be 3 planets on rings 160, 192, and 224. The total number of rings tells us that there is a fantastic number of captured and uncaptured minor planets yet to be discovered. The junk of the solar system. Now let's look at the abbreviated table of the solar system, the first orderly interpretation of Bode's law. Ring 256 appears to be where the sun's belt of protons is. The belt must exist, since the sun's magnetic field is bipolar. Furthermore, it has to be outside of the planets. Keep this graph here, let you look at that real quick. But here we see beyond Pluto, there's up to 3 planet X's, not 1, but 3 planet X's, according to the research of these scientists at all, not just Chan Thomas. It's apparent that our present moon was created on ring 3, Phobos on 5, Deimos on 6. Ring 7 is vacant. That presents a real challenge. Whatever happened to the minor planet from ring 7? The closeness of Phobos and Deimos to Mars tells us that rings 4, 5, and 6 close together a tremendous amount, most probably through a succession of events in the solar system causing the series of cataclysms on Earth. Again, with the electric universe model, which is being presented and espoused in this work before Talbot and Wallace Thornhill started talking about the electric universe. And hopefully we're almost done with this chapter soon. I'm ready to call it quitting time soon. Once orbiting around Mars, Lost could have come close enough to Earth to be stolen from Mars by Earth and the moon satellite so well described on the idol and calendar gate of Tiwanaku. Further, The closest of that satellite to Earth would be justification for the premise that Lost was stolen by Earth from Mars. The multitudes of legends springing from the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago about Venus moving into orbit or Venus changing her orbit most probably describe the capture of our present moon from Ring 3, which in its day, eons ago, evidently was a pretty fair planet with radiation belts orbiting around the sun. In any case, the now vacant Ring 7, the records from Tiwanaku of a retrograde orbiting moon, the plethora of impact craters on the moon and Mars, and the mountains of dense material buried in the mantle of the Earth as uncovered by perturbed orbits in our man-made satellites, and Bode's law, expanded here to include orbits of both fundamentals and harmonics, now offer an orderly meaning to us. Instabilities in the solar system which lead to capture of minor planets by major planets may seem impossible or improbable. However, if we consider one minor instability in the solar system, in the Earth's rotation, we can believe that major changes in instability are possible. You can find it in Encyclopedia Britannica. Mention is made of two astronomically abrupt changes in the Earth's rotation within the last 100 years. This planet of ours is not an inertial body. It's a complex motor generator system, as are the solar system, the Milky Way galaxy, its parent super galaxy, and the universe in which we live. The universe, ladies and gentlemen, is electric. Realize also that astronomers of Tiwanaku recorded stability changes on the calendar gate and the Great Idol. In light of the fantastic stonework in Tiwanaku, characterizing the civilization which ended abruptly about 11,500 years ago, we can look at other great prehistoric works in stone which stand as mysterious monumental memorials to lost engineering techniques. There's Baalbek in Lebanon, formerly known as Heliopolis, where three huge stones are fitted together to make a platform 300 feet long. The mate to the largest stone still lies in a quarry southwest of the town. That mate, believe it or not, weighs over 1,200 tons. Give me a second, my eyes hurt. Ugh. The show must go on. I will finish this. I have a really terrible headache right now. I just want you to know. What fantastic event would cause this prehistoric civilization to leave its tools figuratively hanging in midair? In prehistoric Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where a 20,000-ton monolithic block of stone lies with its steps upside down, overturned by some prehistoric, supernatural wrath of nature. And there, as immobile as the silent boom of the kettle drums of eternity and space, stand walls of incredibly fitted huge. I've seen that actually at Sacsayhuaman. Graham Hancock, if you follow his work, he's actually shown videos and photos of this particular monument. We hear so much about the stone statues of Easter Island. There is also a wall of gigantic, precisely fitted stones suggestive of the same civilization as Sacsayhuaman and Baalbek. Giant stone statues are not exclusive to Eastern Island. They can be found in the Tuamotu archipelago, on Nukuhiva, Fatuhiva, Revive, and Pitcairn, and in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Those statues on Easter Island, which were buried up to their necks and recently excavated, showed a geological environment, the significance of which excluded the excavators. The lessons learned from the strata in the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, and Canyon de Chelly teach us to look for homogeneity. And there it is in the dirt walls of the excavations around the gigantic statues. They were all buried at once in a colossal inundation. It appears to be the reason for the tools being figuratively left in midair in the quarries of Easter Island as well as those in Baalbek. Mother Nature performs her own works in stone which can serve as time clocks for us. Take Niagara Falls, for instance. When the falls first started, the river flowed over a cliff where the mouth of the gorge below the falls is today. There was no gorge. As the years went by, the water broke away the cliff, bit by bit, year by year, century by century, to form the 7-mile long gorge which reposes below the falls today. For the past 100 years, the breakaway of the Canadian Falls has averaged approximately 4.5 feet per year. And when the falls were young, when the gorge's first 2 to 3 miles or so were being carved out by the river, the breakaway was faster since the falls were narrower. The depth of water passing over the cliff deeper, and the height of the cliffs greater. A reasonable early breakaway figure would be 6 to 6.1 feet per year, which would make the age of the falls and gorge below them about 7,000 years. The birth of both falls and gorge coinciding with the oceanographic data, which tells us that the oceans all over the world took a sudden rise of over 200 feet, 450 feet in most places actually, and stayed risen, gradually lowering in height since then to their levels of today. St. Anthony's Falls in the upper Mississippi River in Minnesota bears another telltale story in nature series of recording time clocks. The gorge below those falls is 8 miles long. Over the past century, the breakaway has averaged 5.5 feet per year. If we repeat the same reasoning processes that we used in analyzing the gorge below Niagara Falls, we come up with the same figure for the age of St. Anthony's Falls and the gorge below them, approximately 7,000 years. These datings, plus others, such as the eruption of lava around the pyramid of Cuculco in Mexico, lead us to a date of the last cataclysm, being Noah's flood, of somewhere around 7,000 years ago. Earlier datings, 11,500 years ago, for the abrupt end of the Laurentian Basin ice cap in Canada and the ice cap in southwestern Australia, plus the same date for the jamming burial of countless animals, fish, mammals, birds, and humans in the Pejark Marsh in southeastern Australia, plus the same date for the abrupt end in civilization in Tiwanaku by an inundation, and as well scientific data from all over the world showing an abrupt worldwide climatic change at the same time, established 11,500 years ago as a close estimate for Adam and Eve's cataclysm, the one preceding Noah's flood. And if we accept Tiwanakan dating, it was approximately 11,560 years ago. Isn't it interesting that the new Stone Age and that the old Stone Age datings coincide with the times of Noah's cataclysm and Adam and Eve's cataclysm? It is plain that each cataclysm leaves this planet with less than 1% of all life surviving. And those meager spots all over the world where some humans survive, what is left for them to live by and with? Who has even a shovel? Whatever clothes they have, now short a time those clothes will last. You can understand how each day, the entire day, total effort is spent in finding food, as in plant food, hunting and fishing, just to survive. The fight for survival is as extreme as it is unimaginable. Most of those who survive cannot teach language, ethics, mathematics, history, government, or anything of what we regard as classical education. If there are children, dad tells his kids all about the inundation, and they believe him because he is their dad. By the time there are grandchildren, they don't believe a word he says because, well, he has to be a little off his rocker to tell stories like that. In a matter of a few generations, the cataclysm becomes a verbal legend because who has something to write with or on? And of those who survive, who has the language skills it takes to write it, even if he did have writing tools? Furthermore, who has time to write or teach anything when the top priority of each and every day is survival? Let's go back to dating. Meager data shows the cataclysm previous to Adam and Eve's to be about 18,500 years ago, and the previous one 29,000 years ago. And thanks to mathematician Jess Hale's Structures of Nature, the previous one computes at 43,750 years ago. Mathematically, its function is that of a helicoid. Of all the correlations of data, I regard one of the most striking to be that of Shanidar Cave in Iraq. The Smithsonian Institution expedition, headed by Ralph Selecki and the Iraqi Director General of Antiquities, shared in his work Carbon-14 datings, showed the boundaries between layers laid down by successive civilizations to be commensurate with the dates of cataclysm of 7,000 to 11,500, 18,500, and 29,000 years ago. Plus the incredible fact that no carbon-14 was deposited in the cave during the Caspian Sea North Polar era from 29,000 to 18,500 years ago. It is entirely logical since the cave would have been so close to the North Pole as to plausibly have been closed off by a polar ice cap. Subsequently, no living matter could have entered the cave, and it takes living matter to absorb carbon-14 for us to find and date. This crude cave is as much a memorial to the last four cataclysms as Tiwanaku. Speaking of memorials, has anyone ever lived through a cataclysm and written of his experience, leaving a personal memorial to the occasion? Of course. If we look at Genesis, 3 cataclysms are mentioned there. Noah's inundation, the last one 7,000 years ago, Adam and Eve's 11,500 years ago, and the previous one of 18,500 years ago, barely mentioned in Genesis 2, verse 4. 2 other stories exist, and they are most intriguing. One is from Noah's time, and the other in Adam and Eve's time from Greece. In 1849, Austin Henry Layard started excavating the mound of Kuyun Kinjik on the banks of the Tigris River. It was there that he discovered the fabulous city of Nineveh. Previously known only through the Old Testament, he discovered the palace built by the bloody emperor Sennacherib, Assurbanipal, a grandson of Sennacherib by one of his concubines, had added a library to the palace. He then sent emissaries out to comb his kingdom for original tablets worthy of being in his library, and had the emissaries borrow the tablets and bring them to the palace. Assurbanipal had exact copies made of each one and returned the originals to their rightful owners. That was very nice. He had some 30,000 copies made on clay tablets and put them all in his library. These were the tablets which Layard found. Among the tablets were 12 comprising the Epic of Gilgamesh, a man who was, at that time, a legendary king of the first dynasty of Erech, closely following the Great Deluge. He has since been shown to have been a real human being. Gilgamesh sought the secret of eternal life. How dare you? Go away. Driven to do so by the death of his friend Enkidu, he was told that he should find a man by the name Utnapishtim, who had been granted eternal life by the gods. And he found Utnapishtim, whom Gilgamesh successfully persuaded to tell his story. Utnapishtim stated that indeed he had been granted the secret of eternal life and was told by the gods, O man of Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, abandon all wealth, scorn possessions, save thyself. Tear yourself away from thy house and build a ship. Let it be well measured. Build an ark, in other words. He goes on to describe the ship he built, and from all principles of naval architecture, it was a ship which could not be tipped over, square, probably meaning oblong wherever he built it. He launched it on no less than 8 shakedown cruises. Each time he would bring it back, load it with bitumen, and check it out again. Finally, it was determined to be shipshape, so he held a real Belshazzar's feast to celebrate its completion with beer, wine, venison, and mutton served to all who came. Improve this in your own neighborhood. Some of his neighbors must have thought he was a real nut. On the very next day after the feast, he decided that it was time to load the ship and set it to sea on the cruise for survival. I then boarded the ship. The whole harvest of life I loaded. My family, my friends, the beasts of the field, the cattle of the field, the craftsmen, and the tools of their trades. I made them all embark. I then embarked and closed the door. As soon as a gleam of dawn shone in the skies darkened, black clouds gathered. Inside them, Adad thundered. Soon all light had turned to darkness. Brother could recognize brother no more. The animals of the skies can no longer see each other. Utnapishtim then describes the onslaught of the storm which generated sheer, all-out terror in the ship. Following that, for 6 days and nights, wind and flood marched on. The holocaustic wind overwhelmed the land. When the seventh day dawned, the ill wind was stilled. The oceans, the flood, which had waged war like an army, had ceased. I opened the window and beheld the devastation, and all mankind was turned into mud. As high and as flat as the rooftops lay the swamp, and thousands dead of man and beast and cattle lay floating in the mire. He then proceeded to describe the bumping into the mountain, the releasing of the 3 birds, the bringing back of the leaf, followed by disembarkation, the building of an altar, and more. That is the end of that chapter. I actually finished it. My word. Everything else, single page of death. You know what? I'm going to end this here. This is obviously the addendum. This is the additions to the book, including everything else that comes with it, the appendix. I know this was a long video, but each video is a chapter. All right, with that being said, this has definitely gone on long enough. I am Will Gray Eagle. You are watching the Deep State Chronicle. Again, today is February 16th, 2020. It is Sunday. If you like this video, please share it with your friends and like-minded individuals. And more importantly, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe. I have more important information to share with you. That is all.